The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives. My name is David Schoneman and I'm your host on this program. On Perspectives, we take a look at a variety of issues that are of importance to Nashua residents and taxpayers, especially as we head into election season. Well, today is October 23rd. We have only 2 weeks to go before the midterms on November 6th. There are a lot of exciting races and a lot of very interesting candidates around Nashua this term, and I have one of them in the studio with me today. I'd like you to meet Kevin Scully. Kevin is the state representative for District 33, which is Ward 6 here in Nashua. In Nashua, we have districts, of course, and wards, and unlike other towns, our ward boundaries and district boundaries can be exactly the same, and in fact, they are. So District 33 is Ward 6. Kevin is a first-term incumbent state representative, and he's a Republican. Kevin, thank you very much for coming in.
Well, thank you so much
for
for
having
having
you here.
I really do appreciate the fact that you're giving me this opportunity to speak to the residents of Nashua. I also want to just put in a plug for you. Thank you so much for stepping up and then offering yourself as the state Senate candidate for Nashua. I've come to know you over this, last election cycle. I think that you're an exceptional candidate. I think that your experience as an alderman will make you uniquely qualified to represent the city of Nashua up there. I personally will be voting for you, and I wish you success. I hope you get elected.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. It's always pleasing to hear that. I really appreciate it. As you know, and as I've learned, running for state level it's a lot of work. And yes. I will tell you that running for state senate, it takes an incredible amount of time, and I'm sure it does for state rep too. So thank you for your candidacy.
Sure.
Thanks for coming in. Thanks for the kind words. We'll see how we do. 2 weeks to go.
Yep, 2 weeks.
It's a busy time. One of the things that I liked about your approach, first off, I want to say that this is your first term.
Yes.
But you ran first. It was the first time you ran was 2 years ago.
Yes.
And so you're a Republican running in a Democrat-dominated district in recent time.
Yes.
And you were the largest vote getter in your district. Mm-hmm. I think that's an incredible success story. Tell us about why you ran 2 years ago and sort of what your strategy has been.
Okay. Well, I'm a working person as you are, and most of my adult life was dedicated towards family and job and trying to do that. But I've always been interested in politics. And quite honestly, most of my attention had been at the national level. Part of the reason why I decided to run was I think my family got sick of hearing me, complain at the dinner table about this and that. And of course, then, ultimately, after you say to yourself, well, are you going to complain all your life or are you going to do something about it? Right. So realistically, I thought the best place to start was locally. And when I looked around, I said, okay, I think the state legislature could be a place where I could make a difference. And in my particular ward, we had three Democrat representatives. I know them. They are good people. Mm-hmm. Would love to have them as neighbors. But they have a different worldview and approach from the one I think is ultimately in our best interest in the long run. And so I decided that I was going to run and put really the conservative vision of how we ought to order our society out there to the voters and give them a choice. So they had the choice. They could go with what they had as the status quo, or they could try things what I consider to be the better way, with me as their representative trying to get that done up in Concord. Mm-hmm. So I went out and I knocked on a lot of doors.
How many doors?
I would say over 2,000 on that first, my first run. David Moritaki, who was a sitting state rep who talked me into it, said, Kevin, you're going to not have anybody running against you in the primary, pretend there is, and get out there and start campaigning right now. So I got out there early. I knocked on, as I said, a lot of doors. Mm-hmm. I would talk to anybody who would be willing to talk to me. Mm-hmm. I would explain my vision in terms of how I wanted to represent them up there. I have my little pithy expression, which is
Okay.
I would tell people, I will protect your liberty and your wallet.
I think that's a great expression. I think we're always looking for something that's going to stick in someone's mind.
Yes.
And if it's a long speech, it's not going to stick in someone's mind. But
Exactly.
when they hear that, protect liberty and protect wallet, I think that really resonates.
I got to tell you, the wallet part, you were doing with a lot of people. And that's the approach I took. And I also told them, I said, please understand exactly who I am, what I believe in, what I'm going to do, because I will go up there and do exactly what I'm telling you.
Right.
And I will say this, I kept my promises.
That's great. So you did protect the wallets and you protected their liberty.
Yes.
Taxes, of course, are a big thing. Tell us about some of the feedback you're getting from people regarding taxes, and what can we do to work on some of these?
Well, again, I think the best approach is to try to live within our means rather than saying we want to do 10 different things and we're going to go start taking other people's money in order to try to do that.
Right.
So I think the correct approach is to really set taxes at a low enough rate to encourage growth and prosperity, and then to use that the limitation of what comes in as to how you're going to prioritize the spending of government. I mean, the other approach is to simply say, we're going to try to solve everybody's problems now,
Right.
and we're going to go tax people and take as much money as we need from them to do that. But there's always unintended consequences to those. You know, any approach, you have to understand what you're doing. And I've always taken the approach of to try to limit government to its natural functions and its a reasonable size, and allow the people to make their own decisions, spend the money the way they see fit. And I think New Hampshire is prospering from that approach.
I think it certainly is, and I share that approach that you described. In fact, my wife, I don't get on Facebook, my wife gets on Facebook, and she kind of monitors what they're saying about us, right? And she said to me today, hey, someone complained, and they said that you have a radical view of the role of government in society. Well, my radical view of the role of government in society is that it should meet the essential service, provide the essential services that we need, and it should do what is possible to create the environment where the economy can thrive. Because out of a thriving economy, we're able to generate the revenues that we can use for the other things that we want to fund. I think that the most recent state budget is an excellent case in point.
Yes.
You're in the House. Unfortunately, the House couldn't come up with a budget. It sounds like there was a lot of partisan bickering going on. And in the end, it went over to the Senate, which doesn't normally happen. So the Senate came up with a budget, and then it went to conference committee, and it worked out. But some of the key elements of that budget, which you ultimately supported, certainly, was that business taxes were lowered.
Yes.
The budgeting office for the state said that if nothing else changes, we're going to have a $90 million hole in our budget by reducing these taxes. But businesses respond to tax changes, and I think we should never lose sight of that. If we raise taxes, they're going to respond and think about going somewhere else. And if we lower taxes, they're going to respond and think about coming here and developing here. And that's exactly what happens. So instead of having a $90 million hole in the budget, business activity increased, jobs were created, and we have a $300 million additional revenue, more than we anticipated.
Yes.
And with that $300 million, we were able to fund the things that we needed to do. We increased spending on opioids. We increased spending on more money to the towns for bridges and roads, for infrastructure.
Yes,
we increased spending on mental health. We increased spending on the developmentally disabled community. All these things are possible by the fact that we reduced the tax burden and we created this incentive to come to New Hampshire and to invest here. So that's my my view on the role of government. It sounds like it's yours too. That's the way it should be.
If that's radical, call me a radical.
Exactly. Because the option is to raise taxes, scare people away, and then jack up property taxes on the homeowners in order to pay for all these wonderful things we want to do. These things are important.
Yes.
But we're going to end up burning a hole in the budget. And actually, the last time the Democrats were in charge, when they had the governorship, when they had the House, and when they had the Senate, they created an $800 million structural deficit in the budget that Republicans came in and had to fix, because the tax and spend method just doesn't work, because it kills an economy, kills jobs, and it just doesn't work. So I'm glad that we share that view. And it sounds like the taxpayers, the voters in your district, think the same.
Well, I have to say that I think they're happy with where we're at right now. I also, basically say that if we continue to take this approach, and I think, again, if you want to use a reasonable rate for government growth, you could say population growth plus inflation. If you keep it at that level of increase, it's funny, you will hear some of our liberal friends talk about sustainability.
Right.
I want sustainability in government.
Yes.
And if we keep the rate of growth to population plus inflation, we will never have to get into broad-based taxes. We'll never get ourselves into trouble financially. So I'm here to tell you I'm a big fan of government sustainability.
Good, I am too. I think it's great. We have to have an economy that grows, and government needs to be able to sustain itself. Let's talk a little bit about the broad-based tax issue. Now, there's been talk certainly over the years of some folks say that we need a sales tax or an income tax. I am not in favor of that. I will never support a sales tax or an income tax in the state. We don't need it. Connecticut used to have only a property tax, and they adopted a sales tax and an income tax. My sister lives down in Connecticut, by the way. And the belief was that this was going to somehow lower property taxes. Well, I think property taxes may have stabilized a little bit in the beginning, but now all of those taxes are out of control. And we see a company like General Electric, based in Connecticut, saying we're out of here. And they come and move to Boston, which is not known as a low tax area, but it's lower than Connecticut, and it was just disastrous for them economically. So we don't want to see the same kind of thing happen here. We talked a little bit before the show about the Wayfair decision. This is a sales tax, not a tax on New Hampshire business conducted here, but it was a ruling out of North Dakota, I believe, or South Dakota.
That's correct. Yeah.
Where the Wayfair company needs to pay taxes to other jurisdictions, even though there's no sales tax there.
Right. Well, yeah. Is it North Dakota or South Dakota? All right. It was one of the Dakotas.
One of the
Dakotas.
Dakotas.
Forgive me. I should know this. But they tried to impose. They passed a law saying that they wanted people doing business via the internet to start paying them, collecting their sales tax for them. I think it's the South Dakota Supreme Court found that that was unconstitutional because of the prior rulings of the United States Supreme Court, which said that you had to have a brick and mortar presence in that state in order for you to have enough of a nexus connection with them to be responsible for collecting their taxes. So the Supreme Court ruling, well, it wasn't actually a ruling. What they did was they rendered an opinion. They vacated the ruling of the South Dakota Supreme Court, sent it back to them saying, we want you to consider these things. The world has changed. The nexus of brick and mortar presence may not be enough now, and we want you to start looking at the idea of how much business this company's doing in South Dakota and whether that's enough to now say that they're obliged to collect taxes for them. Now, there's 43 states that collect income tax, so it's not a big deal for most states,
Right.
but it's a very big deal for New Hampshire.
Right.
And so we were looking at this bill saying, oh my God, what are we going to do now? So I want to make sure I say this correctly. A lot of well-meaning politicians on both sides of the aisle felt that they had to do something. They had to do something quickly, and they brought legislation before the House in a special session to say, they wanted to pass a bill. For want of a better term, I mean, I read the bill. I looked at it very carefully, and I felt like they were managing the terms of surrender to the idea that New Hampshire was going to have to start. Our businesses are going to have to start collecting those taxes.
I see.
So I got up in the Republican caucus and I made my feelings very strongly known. We ended up defeating that in the House. And so some people would say maybe we threw everything up in the air, but I think the old saying about act in haste, repent in leisure. I think we were making a terrible mistake. I think we have very strong constitutional arguments for not allowing our business to be strong-armed or manhandled by outside entities to collect these taxes. And so I actually have legislation that I have in that what we're going to do, it's narrow in its focus in that it says if you are a New Hampshire business and you are located in New Hampshire only, when somebody goes to your webpage to buy a product from you, they are traveling from wherever they are to your New Hampshire location. They're buying it here. We don't collect sales tax, and we're not obliged for you to collect some sales tax because you consider that, transaction to happen another place.
If someone drives across the border and shops at a store in Nashua they're not paying sales tax. Doesn't matter where they live or where they're taking the item to.
That's
their
correct.
business.
Right. And I feel the same thing should be true for the internet. They're traveling from where they are
agree.
to our New Hampshire store. We're not going to collect taxes. And more importantly, we're not going to accept any summary or default judgments from out-of-state courts on our businesses saying that they're liable to collect or pay those taxes to out-of-state entities. So that's the gist of the legislation I have in. I'm going to fight very strongly to get this passed. I know there's a lot of people who are behind this concept and thought. Part of the problem was I think the people who wanted to pass what I consider to be the surrender legislation said, well, this is the only way we can do this without, to avoid a court fight. I think we need a court fight. We must have a court fight because this issue is much too important to allow simply to go without a challenge. This really is a attack on our state sovereignty itself.
It is, and it's not just ours. There's other states, a few other states that don't have sales tax, and it's a national issue because it affects the way internet commerce is going to be conducted, and that's not just a New Hampshire issue. It's going to affect everybody. So maybe it'll end up in the federal Supreme Court, national, U.S. Supreme Court at some point. You never know. You might be there.
I hope it does because I think we need to take this up and we need to. Honestly, I think this goes beyond just the collection of taxes because once you say that another state can impose its obligations on one of our businesses, what happens if California says you're doing so much business in California, you're going to have to start enforcing our social policies? Once you've opened this door, this Pandora's box, I think it takes us to really dangerous, scary places. That's why I really feel we have to fight this now. And if the voters decide to send me back up there, I will be leading the charge in this legislation to protect our New Hampshire businesses.
Well, I think we have to do it, and I'm glad you're taking this up. We are the United States of America. So we start with the states, and every state's a little bit different. We have different rules, different laws. There's a border. Things change when you come into New Hampshire. Things change when you go into Massachusetts or California, and that's perfectly fine. Because in this country, we can choose to live where we want to live, and we can go to the state that seems to match our view, and we can live happily there. And that's the way it should be. It's not one country. It is one country, but it's not with a uniform set of state law.
That's correct.
Good. You worked on a couple of other things too, which I think are very important. You had some very good success in your first term. 3 other pieces of legislation that I think are saving people money and making their lives better. Let's run through those real quick.
Well, yes, I did. It's funny. It's ironic because when I went up there, I told people when I asked them to vote for me that I wasn't going to go up there and try to change the world and get all these bills passed because we have so many laws now that, some of which I think go too far to restrict our freedoms. But people came to me with problems. And I looked at the problems and said, okay, this is the appropriate use of government to try to solve these. And the 3 issues were, one was they passed a bill that created an obligation for training and licensing for anybody doing imaging technology. This, in the medical field, this was done in response to the fact that somebody had been overexposed to X-rays. Ionizing radiation is inherently dangerous. You have to be very careful about who's doing it and make sure they know what they're doing. But when they passed the legislation, they threw this wide net and said, well, we'll just pull in all of the imaging technologies. And they were going to subject something as benign as ultrasound to the same type of licensing and training requirements, which was going to cost like $20,000 a person. So your person who was working in one of the physical therapy groups who using ultrasound to help speed, muscle growth or break down scar tissue was going to have to go through this incredibly expensive training and licensing procedure because of the way the legislation was written.
I see.
So I actually got the exceptions carved out, the reasonable exceptions to allow us to continue to use benign imaging technology or to use that same technology to, work on people's injuries without having to do this, so it's more readily available and it keeps the cost from spinning out of control.
Good. So this helps those folks who are in that industry. It protects them. They don't need to get the licensing. They don't need to spend the $20,000 per person, and it offers the protections to our citizens and our residents.
Yes.
But without
reasonable. Yeah.
Without causing an unreasonable burden to some of the others.
Yes. So that was one.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about another one.
The second one, I'm very proud of. I'm part of all of them. The second one was we have a alcohol and drug treatment program put in place for our 30,000 registered nurses here in New Hampshire. We had such a program for our doctors and dentists and veterinaries but we had nothing for our nurses. You know, of course, you know, that reasonable person would say, well, what's wrong with nurses?
Right,
You know,
yeah.
why aren't we trying to help them too, especially when they're on the front line of giving you that care you so desperately need when you're sick and in the hospital. Now, I will also say that I'm a fiscal conservative. So when this issue was brought to me, my first question was, okay, I understand that we really should try to do something. Where's the money going to come from? Who pays? When I started looking into it, I found out that we were overcharging the nurses $350,000 a year on their medical licensing, and we were taking that excess money and dumping into the general fund. It was a slush fund.
Free money.
Free money. So from my perspective, once I found that out, I said, look, you can do either two things. Either give it back to them,
Right.
lower the
Absolutely.
rates, or spend it for their benefit. It's their money, spend it for their benefit. We took the second tact. And I will tell you, I had developed a reputation as a fiscal conservative. So when I went to the committee and said, fellas, here's the good news. It's not going to cost the taxpayers a dime. I had enough credibility with the other conservatives on the committee. It sailed through with the unanimous consent in the House committee, and it actually sailed through with unanimous consent in the Senate as well.
Wow, that's great.
To the governor's desk. So we've done some real good for a lot of people who do good for us.
Good. And you had one other thing that you worked on.
Yeah, this was tough. I mean, had I known what I was getting into, I wouldn't even gone down this road. But when I was door knocking the first time, I ran into a woman who told me what happened to her after she lost her job and got into financial trouble. And then the city started coming after her for late property tax payments and how much money they were charging her on interest. And when they placed a lien on her house, it was just financially devastating.
How much
to
was
her.
the interest they were charging you?
Right out of the gate, they'd hit you with 12% interest if you were late on the payment. And if they put a lien on your house, it was 18%. It was a credit card interest rate.
Yeah.
So when I started looking into this, what I found out was that these rates were set back in the 1980s when interest rates in our country were at all-time highs. And even though the interest rates continue to have gone down over the years, those two numbers never changed because they were fixed by law.
And the municipalities collected that interest,
Oh, yes.
and they liked it.
Oh, they liked it a lot. I hate to say it, and I don't want to pick anybody out.
Sure.
Because I will tell you, all of the big cities and towns showed up at the committee hearing testifying against changing this because honestly it was a giant cash cow for them.
I see.
But what bothered me was who were they taking the money from?
Right.
You know?
That elderly lady is not a cash cow.
No.
And
No.
she should not be viewed that way.
Right.
We have elderly people. You know, we have a big tax increase coming here in Nashua again with the reassessment. And I've spoken with some of the folks who have been getting elderly exemptions, and their taxes are going way up. They don't have this money.
Right.
And to look at them to say, well, okay, you can't pay. Now we're going to charge you an 18% interest on top of your inability to pay. That's just forcing them out.
It was wrong.
It's wrong.
It was wrong, and that's the tact I took. So, as it turned out, because of the incredible resistance from the cities and towns in the New Hampshire Municipal Association, this turned into a huge fight. But we literally had a fight on the floor of the House, and I was able, with the help of some very good legislators who took up my cause, we prevailed. Went up to the Senate, and there was a lot of horse trading going on. The bill ended up not exactly in the form I was hoping for, but it's still a tremendous push in the right direction. Now, instead of 12% interest, they're only charging 8%. And if they put a lien on your house, we've dropped that from 18% to 14%. So I think I've really pushed things in the right direction.
It's a big difference. It's still a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, we got to be cognizant of the fact that as we raise taxes, we're maybe pushing people into an inability to pay. We don't like to put them into that bind. But that can happen, and at least now, the rates won't be as high.
Right. And I feel I've lightened the load on people who least can afford to carry it.
Right. Excellent. One other thing that you worked on that was very near and dear to my heart and that you supported was the reformation we did of the aircraft registration fee. This was a case in point, too, where New Hampshire lost its competitive edge vis-a-vis the other states, where someone bought a new jet, a business bought a new jet, it could cost $300,000 per year to register that jet. New Hampshire would only be $300 in Massachusetts.
Right.
So that's vastly out of balance, and
Right.
we put some legislation through, and thanks to your vote we got that passed, and now we're much more competitive, which is the way we should be. There should be a New Hampshire advantage. We've lost it in some years. We need to begin to regain that and keep our economy strong.
Right. I think the thing that people have to be told over and over again is that government is not the source of wealth, businesses.
Right.
And so everything that you have in terms of your ability to have a job, put food on the table, the roof over your head, all of that is because there is business out there. People who've taken the chance to and spent the long hours to try to build something for themselves. And I don't want government looking at that as an opportunity to take.
Right. They're not a cash cow either, and they're not the enemy.
That's right.
They're folks who are creating jobs,
Yes.
and we need to encourage that. And I think, like I said before, that's what the budget did. We're
Yes.
able to do all these things without raising taxes or fees.
And that's the beauty of it. If you make create the environment where people and businesses can thrive, they will. And as you had mentioned earlier in the show, we cut business taxes, and they responded by filling our coffers with more money than ever
Right.
because we're helping them to succeed by creating the environment where they can do that themselves, and we're seeing the results and the fruits of that.
We have to keep that going.
Oh, yes.
Because if there's a big change in New Hampshire State House, all this could be undone. Because the other side, they take the different view. They don't like the tax cut. Maybe they view those businesses as the cash cow or as the enemy, and they're not. We don't take that view. But if they do something to discourage those businesses, then all that spending is going to have to be borne by the homeowner.
That's correct.
And maybe they want to cause such pain that they can force through a sales tax or an income tax, but that's maybe in their interest, but it's not in the interest of the folks at home.
Right. I believe in the individual. I don't believe that government should be our mother or father. I think that we should tell the government what to do. We want to keep the government limited so we as free and independent people can thrive. And I want to try to do whatever I can to keep it that way.
Well, that's the essence of good representative government. We take what the people say and want. We represent that to the government, to Concord in this case, not taking what Concord says and enforcing it onto the people. That's not the way to do it. Kevin, we're nearly out of time. Anything you want to add? Contact information?
Well, I do have a web page. It's Kevin Scully, KevinScullyNH.org. So you can learn more about me there, and there's actually a link to my Facebook page if you want to go look. So if you guys get bored, you have
Wonderful.
something to do.
Thanks, Kevin, very much for coming in.
Oh yeah, my pleasure.
That. And folks, I want to thank you at home too for tuning in. I'm here today with Kevin Scully, who's an incumbent representative from District 33, which is Ward 6. And we both encourage you to come out and vote on November 6th. Very, very important. Just 2 weeks away. By the time you see this, it'll be much closer. We thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.